Hi, I'm Rachel Winston, and this is Raging Waters in the South China Sea, What the Battle for Supremacy Means for Southeast Asia. Part 1, Chapter 4, China's Century of Humiliation. Let China sleep, for when she wakes, she will shake the world. Napoleon Bonaparte. The West is unequal, unfair, and contemptuous. The Chinese suffered humiliation at the hands of Western powers through agreements from the mid-1800s to the mid-1900s that were deemed unfair and unequal. These treaties were relayed in China's textbooks and symbols to generations of Chinese as the unequal treaties. Western powers demanded respect from the Chinese, who were coerced by a much more powerful, overwhelming military force. Until that time, the Chinese had not given concessions to a foreign power. The Chinese way of authority included a tribute system, whereby foreigners who wanted to trade with China were required to acknowledge the Chinese as being superior and offer tribute to the emperor. This act of respect was followed by kowtowing, an act whereby a patron kneels and bows so that their head touches the ground. To the dismay of Chinese emperors, though, leaders from Western powers did not always bring tributes or kowtow at the Chinese doorstep. Rather, they demanded respect, utilizing their powerful naval force. After a series of battles in the mid-1800s, the Western powers tactically backed the Chinese into signing away the rights to their land and insisted on trade practices the Chinese felt were unfair. These unequal treaties may have opened trade to the West, but they also planted seeds of animosity and resentment that grew into strong trees bearing fruits of rivalry and contempt. Britain was a naval powerhouse. During the First Opium War, Great Britain served a crushing defeat to China. Negotiations had broken down between the British and the Qing dynasty regarding opium trade. Great Britain occupied the island of Hong Kong, which at the time was sparsely populated, and also overtook Guangzhou, formerly Canton. Great Britain began its procession to defeat the Chinese military up the coast and compelled China to concede to trade with fair and reasonable compromise of tariffs, port access, and land ownership. In one of the concessions to end the conflict, China relinquished the island of Hong Kong in 1841. The Treaty of Nanjing was signed in 1842, which formally ended the First Opium War. Great Britain absorbed a new colony in its push to colonize the world. Great Britain fully developed Hong Kong as a trade and distribution center. In 1898, Great Britain was given a 99-year lease on Hong Kong and agreed to return Hong Kong to China in 1997, provided China agreed to preserve Hong Kong's free market system as an Asian gateway to capitalism and commerce. Poverty, suffering, and the surge of communist thinking. During the Century of Humiliation, China suffered. People starved. The country's dynastic system collapsed. Floods ravaged large swaths of the country. China was invaded, and wars seemed almost incessant from the north, south, and east. Millions died. Poverty was endemic. China was no longer the middle kingdom, but had fallen behind the rest of the world in technology, economics, military, and diplomacy. China's civil war ended the spiraling demise of constant incursions and catastrophic destruction. This moment, in 1949, was the turning point of its rebirth. though for the first 25 years the new period was tumultuous at best. The institution of the People's Republic of China, PRC, established in 1949 with Mao Zedong as the chairman of the Communist Party of China, signaled the end of the Century of Humiliation. Mao proclaimed at the top of the Tiananmen Gate, "Fortunately, our People's Liberation Army, backed by the whole nation, has been fighting heroically and selflessly to defend the territorial sovereignty of our homeland, to protect the people's lives and property, to relieve the people of their suffering, and to struggle for their rights." And it eventually wiped out the reactionary troops and overthrew the reactionary rule of the nationalist government. Now, the people's war of liberation has been basically won, and the majority of the people in the country have been liberated. In a quote attributed to Mao Zedong that was popularized but unconfirmed, he declares, "The Chinese people have stood up." Whether or not Mao truly made that declaration, the point is the same. Mao rang in a new period of nationalistic communism with Chinese characteristics. The end of that period called forth a new century, the Great Leap Forward, to quickly industrialize China, and the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, which established the Red Guards, both hunted down and eliminated enemies of the state. They could not be considered success. More than 100 million Chinese died over a 25-year period of starvation, exhaustion, or execution. The four olds, old culture, old ideology, old customs, and old traditions of imperial China were stricken from society's lexicon as the country began anew. Quotations from Chairman Mao Zedong's, dubbed by Chinese citizens the Little Red Book, was published from 1964 to 1976. This red-covered book, which included collections from Mao's sayings and principles, were required reading. Chinese Communist Party unofficially recommended that every Chinese citizen own and carry a copy at all times. Most propaganda images in China displayed people holding the Little Red Book. The book was printed and distributed in more than 100 other countries. Below is a quote that provides a sample of beliefs Mao espoused and shared with the whole world in his book. "At no time and in no circumstance should a communist place his personal interests first. He should subordinate them to the interests of the nation and the masses. Hence, selfishness, slacking, corruption, seeking the limelight, and so on are most contemptible, while selflessness, working with all in one's own energy, wholehearted devotion to public duty, and quiet hard work will command respect." Unlikely to forgive or forget soon. Chairman Mao's policies were devastating, and millions starved during the Great Famine. While few, even in China, would consider them successful, they did inform future Chinese leaders. Mao's image remains prominently displayed on buildings and Beijing statues as a symbol of power and leadership. Subsequent Chinese leaders set goals during the following decades to increase the country's preeminence globally and re-established China as the center of world trade. Goals were set to become an economic and military powerhouse that would never be humbled or humiliated again. With initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative, One Belt, One Road, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, the Silk Road, Ice Silk Road, String of Pearls, and Made in China 2050, China is well on their way. From the onset of the First Opium War, which an unprepared China faced a technologically superior British fleet, China has not forgotten and is also unlikely to forgive the West's trespasses, transgressions, or disrespect. This grudge can be seen in China's propaganda, a resounding narrative that reminds the Chinese people that the legacy they must never forget and they must fiercely overcome. Looking back at the Opium Wars, exploitation, loss of sovereignty, and tremendous shame the Chinese experienced from that period of the Qing dynasty, it is not surprising that China acts the way it does now. Timeline of key events. 1839 to 1842, the First Opium War. The spark that initiated the Century of Humiliation was ignited when British traders smuggled opium into China against the will of the emperor. At the beginning of the 1800s, opium imports increased more than 1,000%. People on all levels of society were addicted. The emperor, seeking to stop illegal opium trade, attacked the British and was overwhelmed. Great Britain sent ships that withstood Chinese attacks and decisively defeated the Chinese armies. 1841, the Chuenpi Convention. The Chuenpi Convention was a tentative agreement between Great Britain and China that was not ratified, but in part used in the Treaty of Nanjing, including the secession of Hong Kong and indemnity and trade agreements. 1842, Treaty of Nanjing. This agreement, ending the First Opium War, was the first of several unequal treaties between China and Western imperialist powers. China paid the British, ceded Hong Kong, established a fair and reasonable trade, as Western countries were given access to Chinese Western trade in 5 treaty ports of Guangzhou, Xiamen, Fuzhou, Ningbo, and Shanghai. The Western states followed with its own 1844 Treaty of Wangxia, signed in a Portuguese city of Macau, which offered similarly favorable trade and access terms. 1850 to 1864, Taiping Rebellion. China faced internal conflict considered a civil war that altered the Qing dynasty, which had ruled since 1644. During the Taiping Rebellion, southern provinces suffered mass destruction as 20 million people died in an attempt to bring religious conviction to the Chinese. Hong Xiuquan, who had been inspired by Christian teachings, ruled at the time. He believed that he was the Son of God and the younger brother of Jesus Christ. In 1851, he took the title of Heavenly King of the newly created dynasty, Heavenly Kingdom of Great Peace. Later, as a result of dissatisfaction with the Manchu leadership, millions of citizens sought relief from extreme poverty. Internal conflict led to the Qing dynasty's later demise. 1851 to 1868, Yan Rebellion. After years of brewing, a peasant uprising began in northern China. The Qing dynasty already faced pressure from the Taiping Rebellion to the south and European traders. The flooding of the Yellow River in 1851 and 1855 led to widespread damage and loss of life. Financially strapped, the Qing dynasty, in an insufficient attempt to resolve the problem, sought support from the Europeans. This alliance unnerved and emboldened the Qing dynasty, which allowed them to overthrow the Nians. Threatened from multiple directions, Qing leaders were unable to quell internal dissent. Ultimately, the rebellious forces were defeated. But the costs to the dynasty were high, and the Qing rulers struggled until their demise in 1911 to 1912. 1856 to 1860, the Second Opium War. The Qing government did not adhere to the Treaty of Nanjing, provoking the British government to attack the Chinese port cities of Guangzhou and Tianjin. The British and French fought together against China in the Second Opium War, winning additional commercial privileges and territory. China's loss was devastating, since the new agreement demanded that the Chinese legalize opium trading and open their ports to Western imperial states. 1860, treaties at Tianjin. These treaties between the Qing dynasty and Russia, France, Great Britain, and the United States were written and signed at the end of the Second Opium War in the Convention of Peking. The final document required painful concessions, including most favored nation clauses, additional ports to foreign trade, rights to travel within the Qing Empire, stationing of diplomatic legations, missionary work, import of opium, the payment of an indemnity of millions of taels of silver. 1884 to 1885, the Sino-French War. France and China fought over control of Vietnam in the Sino-French War, eventually ending in France's victory. 1894 to 1895, the First Sino-Japanese War. China and Japan fought over control in Korea in the First Sino-Japanese War. China's own corruptions led to their demise. 1900, the Boxer Rebellion. China faced an uprising in the Boxer Rebellion from an anti-foreigner Chinese society who resented the Christian missionaries who did not follow Chinese customary laws and practices. Since members of the militia practiced Chinese martial arts, they were known as the Boxers. An uprising of Boxers began with peasants, but were later encouraged by the government. Supported by the Qing dynasty, violence against foreigners increased. The foreigners retreated to Legation Quarter. After Empress Dowager Cixi declared war, an 8-nation alliance came with 20,000 troops to support the diplomats, missionaries, civilians, and soldiers who were under siege for 55 days. The imperial army was defeated and the foreigners were rescued. After plunder, executions, payments, and concessions, the Qing dynasty was further weakened and later ended. In 1903 to 1904, we had the British invasion of Tibet. The British Indian forces invaded Tibet, reaching the capital of Lhasa. They had already conquered Burma and Sikkim and now required Tibet to open its border to British India and to force Tibet under the Qing dynasty authority to pay a large indemnity. In return, the British agreed not to annex Tibet. January 8, 1915, 21 demands. Japan sent 21 demands to China during the First World War. Those extended Japanese control of Manchuria. China was forced to grant special concessions, raising anti-Japanese sentiment in China. 1931, Japanese invasion of Manchuria. Japan invaded Manchuria, seeking raw materials and gaining control of large parts of China. Without declaring war, Japan took over, which violated the rules of the League of Nations. Manchuria had oil, rubber, and lumber needed by Japan's developing industries. China asked the League of Nations to intervene. When the League did not, its credibility diminished. Subsequently, Japan left the League of Nations in 1933. July 7, 1937 to September 9, 1945, the Second Sino-Japanese War. In the Second Sino-Japanese War, Japan sought further control over raw material reserves, food, and labor. In what is known as the Asian Holocaust, the Japanese began its quest with a horrific episode of mass murder, mass rape, and burning of towns and cities. The rape of Nanjing lasted from December 1937 to January 1938. Humiliated and appalled, China used all of its manpower in this war, but ultimately relinquished territories to Japan.